want to welcome all of you back again. This is kind of a pivotal session of the 4. It's going to set up the conversation that I hope will be able to take place next week. We're going to start with prayer. Why don't you stand? This is a song that we all know. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The Church of Christ in every age, beset by change, but Spirit-led, must claim and test its heritage, and keep on rising from the dead. Across the world, across the street, the victims of injustice cry for shelter and for bread to eat, and never live until they die. We have no mission but to serve in full obedience to our Lord, to care for all without reserve, and spread His liberating word.
A reading from the first letter of John. See what love the Father has bestowed on us, that we may be called the children of God. Yet so we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know Him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we shall be has not yet been revealed. We do know that when it is revealed, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Let us pray. O holy God, we give you praise and thanks for letting us be called your children. And yet, so many people don't see us this way because they don't see you. We ask you tonight to help us claim our heritage as your children, and also to help us understand who and what others see in us, in our church, in our faith, that we might better understand how to make your presence known in our world. And we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to give you, as I've done each week, I'm going to give you an overview of what I hope we do tonight. Unlike previous weeks, this time we're going to start with small group discussion, okay? Because each of you had homework to do. And I sent you the homework questions. I'm going to show them to you again, and we're going to start by discussing those homework questions. Then I'm going to acquaint you with what one writer calls religion's intrinsic reality problem. That'll just take a minute or two. Then we're going to take a look at 3 approaches to culture, because what we want to look at tonight is why sometimes our official religious symbols don't connect, and what other symbols that might not be official do connect, and why they connect. So we'll look at, after we look at 3 theoretical approaches to culture, then we'll look at some characteristics of 21st century American culture. Then we'll have another small group discussion. Then we'll conclude with what I call a semiotic approach to faith and culture. Semiotic is just a fancy word for science of signs approach to culture. We've been talking about signs and symbols, so by the time we get there, you shouldn't have any problem with that. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. Then some homework, and then a closing prayer. So let's go to our small group discussion. Now remember what the questions were for your homework. Think about official religious symbols that don't seem to be working for you or for others in our families or society. then what are some of the reasons these symbols don't seem to be working as well or at all? And obviously, this is all going to be your own point of view and some speculation, and in fairness, your wisdom as well. And then, if the official religious symbols aren't connecting as well or at all, what are some alternate symbolic activities or encounters that do seem to engage people today? Okay? So I'm going to give you some time to talk. Presumably you all did your homework. So let me remind you as you share that what works for some might not work for others and vice versa. So we want to be mindful of respecting the sharing that people bring to this and not pass any judgment. Okay? So go ahead and I suggest that you take the conversation in the order of that the questions are posed. So go ahead. Sounds like you did your homework. And eavesdropping on each of these conversations, much of what I'm going to present is going to, I think, ratify some of the things that you've been saying and systematize it a little bit and put some framework around it. So thank you for the homework. And as I do the presentation portion, keep thinking of those official symbols that connect or don't connect and the reasons why, and see how it matches up with what we're going through. And I want to caution everybody that the purpose of this conversation is not to depress people.
Too late.
Because you can stop and think and say, where is everybody? And where have they all gone? Why aren't they coming? All of which are fair questions. But in order to be able to address that situation, I think we have to think it through carefully and understand some of the reasons why that's happening. So it's not to depress, but to equip. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So this past week, I read a book called Deep Symbols. It's been on my shelf for probably 15 years. And I just took it off this past week. And given what we're talking about, and in the course of it's written by a man named Edward Farley, not a Catholic writer, but a Christian. And in the course of his writing, he talked about something he called religion's intrinsic reality problem. And it's up there on the screen. Faith's inability to deliver its own basis and reference, namely God, into the public world of objective evidence. The absent God is then religion's intrinsic reality problem. Okay, that's his assessment of the religion's intrinsic reality problem. Now, I've got that up there because I have reminded everybody in the first couple of presentations that our encounters with God are always and everywhere symbolically mediated, embodied, and constructed. We do not engage God directly, but always indirectly. And when we engage God directly, we're not even aware of the fact that we're engaging God directly. That's something called apophatic theology. It's beyond our comprehension, beyond our ability to put into words. But more often than not, our religious experience comes to us through symbols. And even, frankly, even apophatic experience comes through symbols, the symbols of our own body, our bodily experience. But that's a key contention in these sessions. Our encounters with God are always and everywhere symbolically mediated, embodied, and constructed. That's why the question about which symbols connect and which symbols don't connect is so important for our understanding our religious experience. Robert Cummings Neville, whom I've mentioned before, talks about, as a shorthand definition, that symbolic engagement is taking a sign to stand for an object in some respect. Okay? So we take a religious symbol, let's say the candle, to stand for God. In some respect, God is our light, right? We can take another symbol with respect to God and say, God is my strength, and over again. Okay, so every one of our experiences of God is symbolically mediated. But Neville goes on to say this: it's taking a sign to stand for an object in some respect as qualified by the biology, culture, semiotic systems, and purposes of the interpreter. In other words, the religious object needs to be transformed to the stuff of the interpreter's experience in life. Okay, so God, the religious object here, needs to be transformed symbolically into the stuff of things we can connect with as human beings. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So we've considered the biology, right? The very first session, we talked about human beings as being symbolizing animals. We've considered the semiotic systems. We've talked about signs and symbols. We've talked about reference. We've talked about extensional meanings and intentional meanings. We've considered purpose, developmental levels and dispositions that people bring to symbolic encounters. So today we're going to focus on the cultural context within which symbolizing takes place. Okay? So I'm going to share with you 3 different approaches to culture that I'm familiar with. Full disclosure, for a number of years I taught at the seminary a course called Faith and Culture. So for purposes of teaching, I had to become familiar with some of these things. So Gary Arbuckle is an anthropologist, and his definition of culture is this. A culture is a pattern of meanings. Okay? Think about your experience of culture. A pattern of meanings encased in a network of symbols, myths, narratives, and rituals. Why? Because we are symbolizing animals. All our experience is mediated by symbols. And so it stands to reason that this pattern of meanings is going to be encased in a network of symbols, myths, narratives, and rituals created by individuals and subdivisions. We talked about this last week when we were talking about where do official religious symbols come from. They start in practice, right? And then they get handed down from generation to generation. So people are responsible for creating culture. In fact, one of the things that scientists will point out is unlike animals who aren't symbolizing, we have the ability to pass on our knowledge and our experience from one generation to the next. We're not simply people who are prisoners of our genes. Okay, so there can be a certain kind of advancement over the ages in culture and the shapes culture takes. So it's created by individuals and subdivisions as they struggle to respond to the competitive pressures of power and limited resources in a rapidly globalizing and fragmenting world, and instructing its adherents about what is considered to be the correct way to feel, think, and behave. All right, so cultures, sometimes, I suppose more often than not, without our realizing it, they tell us what is real. They tell us what we have to believe. They tell us how we ought to behave. They tell us what ought to be normative. Okay? And a lot of the times, because we're so close to, and it's like we're fish in the water. You know, we don't see the water. Okay? So this is Arbuckle's approach to culture. Then there's another approach by Clifford Geertz. He wrote an article years ago called Religion as a Cultural System. It was in a book called The Interpretation of Cultures. This book goes back 50 years, so this is not new, but it's still a pretty widely cited definition of culture. But now he's talking about religion. Religion itself is a cultural system. So he says, it's a system of symbols. Okay, there's some consistency here, huh? A system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men. I put sick after that, and women too. It establishes these powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence. Okay, culture tells us how things are. And religious culture, how things are at levels beyond just the human and creation. Clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. It's a very interesting definition. I think it's got a lot of merit. So, system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, long-lasting moods and motivations, formulating them a general order of existence, and making things seem really, really realistic. Okay? Then Neville has an approach to culture which has to do with worldviews and sacred canopies. And so to, again, just reinforce some of the things that we have been saying, our world as experienced, including our experience of the divine, is thoroughly shaped by symbols. And Neville says this: without symbols, we would just be creatures buffeted by the countless stimuli that bounce off of us all the time. Even now, we're being bombarded by millions of stimuli, but somehow, symbolically, we find a way to choose from those stimuli and to organize those stimuli into an intelligible experience. So therefore, we are interpreting animals who must assess the truth of the interpretations we make about our engagement, including engagement with the divine. Okay, this is what we think is happening. This is what we claim to be happening, but we have to assess its truth. He says everything can serve as a sign or a symbol through which we experience our world, including the divine. So then, among the many signs available to us, we choose some from among them all to construct what he calls a worldview. And that's the definition that's up there. A worldview is a set of signs, more or less coherent. And that's an important thing, more or less coherent, because symbols often operate in ways that are, they seem all over the place, but they're definitely interconnected. More or less coherent, by which individuals who hold the worldview are oriented to the things in the various domains with which they directly and indirectly interact. And so on the screen there you see one of the domains in which people interact is driving. Okay. And here's a system of signs which forms a kind of worldview for people who drive. It's a very small subset of that worldview, but it gives you an idea of what a worldview is. But then he goes on to say, there's such a thing as a sacred canopy. And he's borrowing language here from another sociologist by the name of Peter Berger. So he says, sacred canopies are a subset of the worldview that we have. Our worldview embraces many, many different domains in which we dwell. A subset of the symbol is of the worldview is a sacred canopy. These symbols come together to orient us to the divine, to the outermost elements of the symbolized world. The outermost elements in the sense of approaching the transcendent. Okay, you can say it that way. Or the deeply immanent. And he says it may include symbols of religions, but symbols may be religious and not a formal part of any religion. In fact, Neville says this about sacred canopies. So if you imagine that we dwell under a sacred canopy where our religious symbols come together and interconnect, and imagine it as a canopy. If you look at that picture, there's actually a canopy there. He says that very often the symbols in the sacred canopy are most effective when the canopy tears, because it shows the symbols to be incomplete. It shows them to be, they don't capture the whole reality, but they open us up to the sense of something beyond the reality. So imagine that sacred canopy tearing, and look what happens. It opens up onto the splendor and the depth of the universe. Okay. So now you can see that there are three. They're different approaches, but they're very much related. Every single one of them has to do with the symbolic being that which mediates our interactions with one another in our world and our God. Okay? So now I'm going to list for you what I have identified as characteristics of our worldview / sacred canopy / culture. Okay? And I've listed them on the sheet of paper that I've given you. But we're going to talk about some of them in a little more detail. So first of all, and I heard this from many of the tables, one of the aspects of our culture / worldview is we live in a digital age. right? Most recently, we're learning about artificial intelligence, right? And boy, what a different experience. Just yesterday, I saw a news report saying that give a digital computer, a computer with artificial intelligence, 20 seconds of your voice, and you can give them a text to read it. It will sound just like you. And so now, not only do you have to worry about people who are posting things and posing to be like you, but you have to worry about getting a phone call from someone who sounds just like your friend and not knowing it's just like your friend. Pretty scary stuff, huh? And another part of the digital age is the digital divide. Some people have access to this stuff, and as much as it becomes commonplace for us, there are significant portions of the world community that don't have access or don't have the same kind of access. So some of that happens in our own culture. So there's digital age and digital divide. And then there's, of course, social media, which isn't the same thing necessarily. This is kind of a subset of a digital age, because a digital age is also the computer that helps us to do our work, you know. So social media, which is, again, I heard everybody talking about this at the table. This is a part of our culture. Political polarization. I love this cartoon. 2 + 2 = 4. No, you idiot. 1 + 3 = 4. In fact, this might be one of the more intelligent political conversations that we've heard recently. But in the last several years, political polarization has increased significantly. There's always been divisions politically, but the kind of polarization that's experienced, I wrote about this in my column last week, where lying becomes the patterns that people embrace. And how do you know what's true and how do you know what's not true? So polarization is something that is an assault upon truth, but it's also something that makes us feel secure, and when we bump against some other opinion, it questions that, or calls into question that security. Then there's globalization and its resistances. We are an increasingly interconnected world, and recognizing those interconnections implies that we have to think about ourselves as connected and to realize that we make decisions that not only affect us and our place in time, but affect others in other parts of the world. Huh? And sometimes that means really needing to think differently. You know, an example in the news just today and yesterday was President Biden's decision to drill in Alaska. You know, and people have pointed out one of his big campaign promises that he wasn't going to do that. But you can imagine the set of pressures that were placed upon him by people of Alaska and the oil companies, etc. Those are aspects of globalization and resistances to globalization. Some authors point out that subcultures are resistant to globalization because they don't want to lose their cultural identity. Okay? I think a good example of this might be Native American cultures, you know, who appear in the news every now and then. Secularization. So secularization, I'll tell you what, every author you read about secularization defines it differently, but this is as good as any. Okay? Secularization is the transformation of a society from close identification with religious virtues, religious values and institutions, toward non-religious or irreligious values and secular institutions. Another writer says, secularization is the process by which the ultimate human good is perceived to be achievable without reference to the transcendent or supernatural. Let me say that again. Secularization is the process by which the ultimate human good is perceived to be achievable without reference to the transcendent or supernatural. certainly I think we see evidences of that in our 21st century American culture. Then there's religious pluralism. I think this is an extremely significant determinant characteristic of our culture. When I was growing up, I was Catholic, and I thought everybody was Catholic. Okay? I was taught that I shouldn't go to a non-Catholic church. Okay? And what a step it was to connect with those Protestants and Lutherans, etc. And it was only when I was in college that I became aware of the fact that there were other religions besides Christianity, where I learned about Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism and Confucianism and all kinds of other world religions. If you think about what happens when you grow up in a religion where, as a cultural system, this explains who God is and what the reality is about, and you bump into somebody in another religion or learn of another religion who believes just as strongly as you do the tenets of their own religion, that creates a little bit of turmoil. Huh? And it's what one writer calls the fragilization of belief, the exposure to other world religions. Okay? And that's part of our current culture. And then there's fundamentalisms. Fundamentalisms isn't just belief, but it's the way those religious beliefs are held. So, if you look at this guy here, and the intelligent designer made the universe this big. And then we see the cross. He made it as big as Christianity, you know. Then you have, we're familiar with Islamic fundamentalism. Islam will dominate the world, behead those who insult Islam. Perhaps that's an easy target. And then you have, it's another symbol of kind of like the violence that fundamentalisms can wreak on one another. Religious fundamentalisms in particular. I suppose this is another dimension of polarization. Diminished religious authority. Clergy sexual abuse. Hear no pedophiles, see no pedophiles, speak no pedophiles. We all know that there are many people who disengaged from Catholicism and even forms of Christianity because of the frequency with which sexual abuse happened. I think I told you a story once that there was a woman in the parish here who approached me, she's now deceased, who approached me after Mass one day and said, my son was abused by two priests, one who was in the parish and the other who was his high school chaplain. And she said, you know, I was talking about clergy sexual abuse. She said, you need to be talking about this all the time. And it's why we pray for victims of clergy sexual abuse every weekend. But what this does is it significantly challenges and diminishes religious authority, especially religious authority by the people in positions of power. Okay. And then there's scientific worldviews. So there's the new cosmology, you know, the sense that the universe is much bigger than we ever imagined, and there might be more than one. There is, there's evolution, which, you know, is still referred to as the theory of evolution, but it's pretty much established scientific fact. There's quantum physics. I think that's what I got there. Neuroscience, which we've talked about here. And here's an interesting quote from an evolutionary anthropologist named E.O. Wilson. He says, and I quote, "Science is answering questions that in the last 50 years, philosophers have given up as unanswerable. Who are we? Where have we come from? Where are we going?" So science is answering those questions. So scientific worldviews are a significant part of our culture. And going back to my friend Neville, he wrote an article in which he said one of the biggest challenges that we face culturally is, this is his language, the incommensurability of the religious imagination and the scientific imagination. He said those imaginations are shaped so differently by different symbols that to get those two to talk to one another and to coexist with one another is really hard. And he says that, some people are able to accomplish this by separating those two domains. So you have a nuclear scientist who's a fundamentalist Christian. Those things would seem to be incompatible with one another. Some people, and because they're incompatible, some people just say, I'm going to dwell in this world for 6 days and in this world for the 7th day. He says, I think we need to find ways to make those imaginations intersect with one another and interact with one another. Easier said than done, but it's a great article. The new atheism. The people in this, the people in this circle are all authors who have written extensively about the new atheism and saying there is no God, and each of them have different reasons for talking about why they don't believe in God. Parish, for example, talks about fundamentalisms and how it creates all kinds of conflict unnecessarily. Others talk, I can't remember which one specifically, but they just think that the evidence is overwhelming, that because of evolution, religious claims just don't make sense. You can see there's Harris, the end of faith. In science we trust. I think I mentioned once before that there is an organization whose sole purpose is to get people to not be religious because they think it's crazy. So this is another dimension of our culture. Some of this atheism is avowed, and some of it is just operational, I'd say. It's just where people are coming from. Consumerism. This is really a big part of our culture. Just think of Black Friday, which is now turned into like the Black Month before Friday, etc. Okay, and how about this? Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. In the consumer culture, I shop, and therefore I am. Everything is reduced to a commodity, divorced from its conditions of production. So think about the last time you ate something and you know where it came from. Think about chickens and fish and vegetables. And, we take those things for granted, but our experience of them is divorced from their conditions of production. Another aspect of consumerism is something some writers call simulacra. Simulacra. And things appear to be real, but they are not. Think of advertising. How many times in advertising do things appear to be real, but they're not? Okay. And I'm going to leave the last one because it's not necessary. Okay. Sports. I had lunch with a man yesterday who is got a really deep spirituality. He's steeped in Ignatian spirituality. He worked for the Westside Catholic Center for a lot of years. He's now a retired attorney. But I ran this list of things by him and just asked his opinion. And he said, in his opinion, sports was the single biggest cultural determinant that we're facing, or that influences us. Perhaps from Catholicism, that there was a time a few years ago when the diocese had to mandate you can't play CYO football or basketball on Sunday mornings. Okay, and people will tell you that sports continues to be, people invest more in sports and sports activities than they do in almost anything else. And most recently, betting became legal here in Ohio. And I've mentioned before that there's not a commercial break that goes by, that there's not at least one commercial which is talking about betting. What does this say about us as a culture? Huh? What does it say about what attracts us, what engages us? Ethnicities. One writer says there's voluntary and involuntary ethnicities. says that an ethnic group is defined as a gathering of people within a larger society having real or putative common ancestry, memories of a shared historical past, and a focus on one or more social markers, especially physical qualities, such as skin pigmentation, particular customs, language, religion. But sometimes ethnicity, people perceive their ethnicity, sometimes they have an involuntary ethnicity when people put them in this ethnicity. They might see themselves differently, but they're labeled or categorized as belonging to a particular ethnicity. Then there's class differences. This is a great drawing here. The difference between labor and capital. I guess this looks like capital, this looks like labor, but they actually look kind of alike, don't they? And the fact that they're different, or we treat them differently, is an indication of perhaps the challenge and maybe evil of class differences. I like this one. One person's violin and another person's fiddle. So class differences, the unemployed and homeless, the working class, the middle class, the upper class. I guess you could define those in a lot of different ways. And then individualism. I think this certainly is a pretty dominant characteristic of 21st century American culture. I like this one here, where these individuals are all busy sawing off the limb on which they're standing, because they're going to do it their way, Like this one, there's all this community here, and there's the rugged individualist, So those are images. Those are symbols of individualism. By the way, all these pictures that I'm showing you can be taken as symbols of our 21st century American culture. Feminism. Feminism is actually now in probably, certainly not new anymore. It takes different shapes than it did when it first arose back in the late 60s, early 70s. But these are some of the symbols. The Me Too movement, equal positions with equal pay, we can do it. So those are not new, but they are aspects of our 21st century American culture. And then there's the LGBTQIA+ issues. I don't pretend to know what all those letters stand for. However, I will tell you this. Among young people, I don't think there is an issue which alienates people from church more than this one. Because when church communities, Catholic or otherwise, come out and take stands that are contrary to what young people just take for granted with respect to gender, they don't get engaged, just walk away. Okay? It's perceived as not a challenge, but irrelevant. Diversity. This is obviously, these things are all connected to one another. Okay? There's a lot of diversity in our culture. How about this? Change is constant. In fact, change is the only constant. And so you see pictures of that. Okay? I think that's true. So now, and obviously we could identify more influences or characteristics of 21st century American culture. But now for a small group discussion, and again, you've got the list in front of you. Which of these cultural characteristics, in your opinion, or in your experience, have the most powerful or important influences on religious affiliation or participation in our place and time? Which, if any, are positive influences on religious affiliation and practice? And obviously, there's a lot of right answers here, so don't be afraid to share. Go ahead. I thought much of what I was going to be presenting was going to be kind of ratifying and systematizing some of the things that you were talking about at your table and expanding upon them. And I hope that that delineation of characteristics of American culture and ideas about what culture is helpful. What we're going to do now is take a look at faith and culture, a semiotic framework for assessment. Again, semiotic simply means theory of signs, okay? So American approaches to semiotics says that signs are not just words and pictures, but they're any perceivable reality, okay? And that makes this theory of semiotics, I think, particularly rich or fertile ground for continuing the conversation. We have seen more than once in these weeks that signs take on their meaning in relation to other signs. And that's what we've been talking about all night. How all these determinants of culture take on, you can see that they inter-influence one another, okay? And the range of meanings a sign can take for its recipient depends upon the context in which the sign is placed. Really important point. Depends on the context in which the sign is placed, as well as the recipient, or the interest which the recipient brings to it. So it's context and interest. So I'm going to give you a mathematical analogy. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I don't think too much. So how many of you would agree that 1 over 2 equals 2 over 4? Do you agree with that? Okay. And really the significance of the equal is that the relation between the 1 and the 2 is the same as the relation between the 2 and the 4. So if I was going to say 1 over 2 equals x over 4, what would x be? 2. Very good, class. And if I were to say 1 over 2 equals 2 over x, what would x be? 4. Also very good, class. And how about this one? 1 over 2 equals 2 over 3 minus 2 plus 1. Is that right?
No. 3 minus 2 is 1, but 2. 2 over 2 equals 1.
All right, so I wasn't very good with that. That's my mistake. But here's the key. Now suppose that I really, really liked the number 1. Okay, I mean, I grew up with the number 1. It was part of my culture. It shaped my way of thinking about things, so that when I go 1 over 2 equals, and I put 1 over 4, what happens? It's not the same meaning, right? The relation between the numerator and the denominator is not the same. Or suppose I really like the number 6. Okay, so 1 over 2 equals 2 over 6. Nope, because the relation is different. Okay, so now let's take this one step further. Symbol over context equals symbol over context. Okay, so if I take a symbol that originates in one context and then transpose it to another context using the same symbol, it's very possible, if not likely, that that relation is not going to be the same. Okay? So the example that I like to use is this. It's a very easy one. How many of you sing Christmas carols? Okay. How many sing Deck the Halls with boughs of holly, right? And how about that phrase, now this goes back 40, 50, 60 years, don we now our gay apparel. Okay, when that song was written, it meant one thing different than it does today, right? And that's because the context has changed. So what do we make of this, okay? So if the context changes and we want to maintain the meaning of the symbol that 50, 60, 100 years ago, then we may very well have to make modifications to the symbol in order for that relation to be the same. Or we take on the daunting task of trying to reshape the culture. And recall the determinants of culture and how they're so much a part of who we are and how we are that we're immersed in them. To change a whole culture is really a difficult thing. But herein, to me, herein lies the challenge and the opportunity for Christianity and other religions. Okay? Because our context is different than it was in ancient Christianity, different from what it was in an ancient European Christianity, different from what it was in the time of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, different than what it was the time of the Council of Trent after the Reformation, different from what it was 100 years ago, 50 years ago. I'll go back 60 years, we were still doing Mass in Latin. Okay? So you bring those symbols forward into a different cultural context, and they're not going to mean the same thing. They just are not. So we can do all that we want to, and one response is, well, we just need to educate our people better. Yes and no, right? Because if the dominant influences which shape imaginations are so much bigger than the sacred canopy, or if the sacred canopy is tearing, then better education alone is not going to make that equation correct. We may have to make some modifications. Or, again, we take on the whole context. There's a branch of an approach to theology which is called enculturation, which tries to make symbols be more relevant to the present time. It's in the directory for catechesis. I think that's a big challenge. But I think this is the issue that we really have to wrestle with. Because if symbol over context is to equal symbol over context, and we want to be faithful to our tradition, ironically, there may be things that have to change in the tradition in order to maintain that fidelity. I know, it's mind-bending. It's mind-bending, and I don't presume to have all the answers, but I think it's one way of framing the challenges that we face. About a month ago, I was a participant in a meeting of all the pastors and principals of Catholic schools in the diocese. All the pastors, even if the pastors didn't have schools, and principles. And it was to roll out something called an initiative called Keeping the Faith, which has been in the planning stages for some time. And one of the major things that Keeping the Faith wants to do is to create, is to want to pass on the faith, want our children to be able to understand and embrace Christianity. But in the course of that meeting, Bishop Malesic said something that I wrote down immediately. And you'll see why. He said, our kids need to be able to swim in a Catholic culture. Think about that. Our kids need to be able to swim in a Catholic culture. And my question is this even possible? Is it achievable? And is it desirable? They might be in a Catholic subculture for a few hours of the day, 5 days a week. But when they're immersed in a culture much broader than the Catholic culture, which is shaped by the determinants that I mentioned, do we want our kids to learn how to swim in a Catholic culture, or do we want them to be able to swim in a wider culture in which they can encounter God? I think it's a tough question. And you can see that what I'm suggesting perhaps shapes our pastoral strategies going forward. If we want to hand on the faith, if we want people to connect with the God in whom we believe and the God who we have experienced in our lives, then how do we account for all of this complexity? Okay? If you get a headache going home, that's okay. I mean, this is So with all that in mind, here's your homework for next week. And it's on your sheet. It's on the yellow sheet. Now, my presupposition is that even given all of this stuff, God still finds us. Okay? I did a course called Finding God Where God Finds Us. God still finds us. We have to figure out under what conditions does God find us, and do we allow ourselves to be found. So your homework is to try to identify an experience or situation in which you were convinced God was present, active, and involved. Perhaps a time when you felt you were caught up in something bigger. Okay? And then, what was it about that experience or situation that convinced you? All right? On the one hand, the first part of this might be relatively easy. The second one might be a little more challenging. But I invite you to wrestle with those during the coming week, and we'll see where we go with the issues that I've raised today. Okay? Finding God where God finds us. Because God will find us. Remember, any concrete created reality can be a symbol that mediates the divine presence under the right circumstances, the right motivations, the right network of meanings, etc. Okay? So thank you again for your presence here tonight. I continue to be impressed by the level of engagement with both the content and the conversation. I think the conversation is as meaningful and as important as the content that I'm presenting. Please stand, we're going to have a closing prayer. Oh, there was a third question, I forgot. What signs or symbols, official or unofficial, helped you to interpret or understand the experience that you're going to be thinking about? And again, all three questions are on that yellow sheet that I provided. So together, Holy Wisdom, lamp of learning, bless the light that reason lends. Teach us judgment as we kindle sparks of thought your Spirit sends. Sanctify our thirst for knowledge and the truth that sets us free. Come illumine mind and spirit, joined in deepest unity. Holy God, the hope of nations, tune us toward your righteous will. As the symphony of ages claims our best, our finest skill. Shape our search for peace and justice through prophetic deed and word. Christ conduct us, set our rhythm, that God's praise be ever heard. Thank you again. And next week, I'm really going to rely on the wisdom you bring to this conversation to help move the conversation and maybe help shape our pastoral strategy at Our Lady of the Lake going forward. So it'll be a fruitful conversation, I hope. You want to be careful on your way out. It might be very icy and invisible ice. Drive safely. And thanks again.